I did not know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do the things I wanted. Frederick Douglass. North had a lot more freedom, and there were differences in the way slaves and free blacks lived. Somehow, through all the difficulties, slaves in the North and South had no rights. The lives they lived were hard ones, and freedom seemed so far away. We African Americans had some rights, while slaves were completely stripped of freedom. Masters viewed slaves as something to be worn out, like clothes. They only provided slaves with enough to stay alive. Once a week, slaves were given a ration of bacon, molasses, and cornmeal. They lived in crowded, rough cabins, and many had gardens or hunted. Clothing was homespun and made of coarse Negro cloth. Mills in the North made clothing specially for slaves. Slaves were provided each year with 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, 1 jacket, another pair of trousers for the winter, a pair of socks, and a pair of shoes. Shoes were so poorly fitted that many slaves went barefoot. Kids too young to work were given 2 linen shirts a year, just like the adults, but if the shirts failed them, they went naked. Slaves were provided with more medical care than their owners, but it did little to improve their health. Although slaves had better medical care, there weren't many other things that were good for them. Slaves were worked from dawn to dusk and most of the time after dark. Some of the chores included carrying water, splitting wood, feeding the pigs, shucking corn, cleaning cotton, and many other jobs of all difficulties. Not all slaves worked in the fields. Some worked as carpenters, seamstresses, blacksmiths, and servants. Slave young, slave long was a popular saying by the slaves. No matter how hard slaves worked, they never got the freedom they deserved. Working conditions for not only slaves but free blacks as well depended on where you lived, the North or the South. The South contained harder working conditions for free blacks and slaves both, and there weren't many differences between those who were enslaved and those who had freedom.
Through all the difficulties the North and the South faced, they kept the brightest glimmers of hope. Yes, the North and the South had their differences, but the thing they really had alike was the unity the groups shared. Free blacks in the North had more real freedom. They were still discriminated, but they received more rights than those in the South. The North and South, free and enslaved, all had their ways to maintain hope and happiness. A Disney movie titled Song of the South, banned in the U.S., contains a main character who is indeed a slave. The slave managed to always be happy by singing, which is true to history. Slaves and free blacks practiced many different things, both unorthodox and orthodox. Southern slaves were stripped of their rights to assemble, and when they attended church, their slave masters had to attend as well to restrict all banter. Slaves in the North and South practiced something called a quilting bee. Quilting bees were a once-in-a-blue-moon opportunity for enslaved women to express themselves and tell stories through cloth and needles, all while coming together as a unit. Being surrounded by other slaves made them have a sense of security and sparked hope in all. Slaves participated in community events such as coming together and singing, or individual acts like writing in diaries or writing poems.
Slaves did use these things to keep themselves grounded, but eventually lost these bright sparks in their veins. It had pushed to the point of rebellion. Most rebellions had caused changes in the laws and how things worked around both northern and southern states. For example, in the historic Nat Turner Slave Rebellion, the result of one uprising was 55 to 65 white people slaughtered, 56 slaves executed by the state, and laws being passed prohibiting education for all blacks and ripping the right to assemble from all of the African descent. Nat Turner's rebellion brought several white militias to form, and they murdered more than 200 slaves. Another revolt, titled Gabriel's Rebellion, was an interesting case and incredibly mysterious. Gabriel is considered a difficult figure to fully reconstruct from surviving historical evidence, according to History.com. He was a blacksmith slave and was a crucial element to the American Revolution, among many other blacksmiths. But unlike the non-enslaved blacksmiths that took part, he received no benefits. This angered him, so he brought together a large group of fellow slaves and wanted to begin an uprising. His plan was to lead his troops into Richmond, Virginia, but he postponed it due to bad weather conditions. Slave owners eventually caught on to the plans because some slaves had informed them of the plan. Gabriel fled to a town called Norfolk to escape the suspicious government and slave owners. A slave there spotted him and told the government for an award. They accepted, caught Gabriel, and executed him along with his 2 brothers. His 2 brothers were never involved in the act, neither were a portion of the executed slaves. They were just simply killed because the government was too suspicious. The slave who gave the government his location never received the full award. Rebellions by the slaves in the North and the South both caused the death of many slaves and brought slaves across the country one step closer to freedom. On December 6, 1865, slavery was abolished. People were still going to treat free blacks and slaves wrong, but you can't control everything. The final step to freedom was completed, and the world of slavery was changed forever.